excellence, black, excellence, black, excellence. Look at me black and I'm excellent. 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 Black, excellence, black, excellence, black, excellence, black, excellence. Look at me black and I'm excellent. 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 And I'm in black like a funeral. Too many cops making funerals. And they just act like it's cool to me. Look at me black and I'm beautiful. Look at me black and I'm beautiful. You just sweat like a cubicle. Can't draw my circle like hula. I go to work every day. I'm trying to double my pay. I'm trying to triple my wage. Don't think we working the same. I came accustomed to pain. I'm a descendant from slaves. Thank God we made it today. You gon' remember my name. Black, excellence, black, excellence, black, excellence, black, excellence. Look at me black and I'm excellent. 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 Black, excellence, black, excellence, black, excellence, black, excellence. Look at me black and I'm excellent. 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 Black and I'm proud, rose grown from cracks in the ground. Should have been born with a crown. I was a king as a child. We were all destined to fail. Our screams nobody could hear, but still somehow we prevail. Found strength and power of will. Black, say it loud. Black and I'm proud. 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 Black. I go to work every day. I'm trying to double my pay. I'm trying to triple my wage. Don't think we working the same. I came accustomed to pain. I'm a descendant from slaves. Thank God we made it today. You gon' remember my name. Black, excellence, black, excellence, black, excellence, black, excellence. Look at me black and I'm excellent. 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 Black, excellence, black, excellence, black, excellence, black, excellence. Look at me black and I'm excellent. 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 Black.
Welcome to a night of Black excellence presented by Apostle Clarence Langston and Pastor Robin Langston. Get ready to dive into the rich culture and history of Black people. Learning unsung history, rich treasures, and inspiring storytelling of royalty, perseverance, unity, strength, and love. This is an interactive night for the entire family, so gather around and feel free to use the comment section as a place of community. Interact, share, and like because tonight is going to be excellent. Let's start the night where it all started, in the continent of Africa.
Afonso I was the first ruler to modernize Black Africa on a grand scale. He encouraged his people to learn Christianity and new skills in masonry, carpentry, and agriculture. Afonso streamlined politics, established modern schools, and later became the first ruler to resist the slave trade. Promoting industry and agriculture, Hatshepsut may be the greatest female Egyptian ruler of all time. As the first woman in recorded history to preside over a nation, Hatshepsut cast aside the theory of male supremacy. Her spirited defiance of male dominance for 30 years endured to the very end, as evidenced by the discovery of her tomb in the Valley of the Kings. When Sani Ali Burr came to power, Songhai was a small kingdom in the western Sudan. With a ferocious force, the warrior king won battle after battle, routing marauding nomads, seizing trade routes, and ever expanding his domain. He captured Timbuktu, bringing into the Songhai Empire a major center of commerce, culture, and Muslim scholarship. His greatness is still legendary among the Songhai people today. Askia the Great was a fair and deeply religious man who at times fought established tradition to rule in the best interest of his people. A devout Muslim, he ruled Songhai strictly according to Islamic law. Askia Muhammad Touré united the entire central region of Western Sudan with a government that is still revered today. A wise and beautiful woman from Nubia so captured the heart of the pharaoh she changed the course of history. Tai's beauty, intellect, and will so took Pharaoh Amenhotep III. He defied his nation's priest and custom by proclaiming this commoner his great royal spouse. Amenhotep declared that, as he had treated her in life, so should she be depicted in death as his equal. And so the colossal sculpture ordered for their temple thus portrays them as a pair of majestic monarchs, both proud, both noble, both serene. A flamboyant leader and world figure, Mansa managed vast resources to benefit his entire kingdom. In 1324, he led a holy pilgrimage of 72,000 people from Timbuktu to Mecca, over 6,000 miles. So spectacular was this event that Mansa Musa won international prestige for Mali as one of the world's largest and wealthiest empires. A strong leader and military innovator, Shaka is noted for revolutionizing Bantu warfare through standardized weapons and special tactics. Many enemies would flee at the mere sight of Shaka's troops. With cunning and confidence as his tools, Shaka united all tribes in South Africa against colonial rule. For hundreds of years, Nubia and Egypt had been at war. But Nefertari's marriage to King Ramesses II, Pharaoh of Egypt, brought the fighting to an end. The marriage began as strictly a political move, but it later grew into one of the greatest royal love affairs in history. In fact, the temple which Ramesses built for her at Abu Simbel is one of the largest and most beautiful structures ever built to honor a wife and to celebrate peace. One of the greatest monarchs of the Congo, King Shamba, had no greater desire than to preserve the peace. He designed an extremely democratic government featuring a system of checks and balances that represented all Bushango people. Also, Shamba promoted the arts and crafts to their highest level during his reign. Regarded as one of the greatest generals of all time, Hannibal and his powerful African armies came close to defeating the mighty Roman Empire. His audacious moves and tactics have been studied and successfully imitated as recently as in World War II. The genius of Hannibal brought Carthage great prosperity and prestige. The identity of the Queen of Sheba has long been debated, but indications are that she was the Ethiopian queen, Makeda. According to legend, she was fascinated with the wisdom of the great King Solomon of Israel. Upon meeting, the king and queen were equally intrigued with one another. Fondness grew into love, and their union produced history's longest line of royalty descendants. Returning to Ethiopia, Makeda's influence transcends centuries as the Judeo-Christian tradition remains embedded in modern Ethiopia. Teaching a doctrine of love and peace, Akhenaten was the first ruler in recorded history to believe in the concept of one God. He and his wife, Queen Nefertiti, changed Egyptian culture so radically that their influence was felt centuries later through more natural visual art styles and a fuller, warmer language for poetry, songs, and storytelling. At the age of 16, this great Nubian king led his armies against the invading Assyrians in defense of his ally Israel. It earned him a place in the Bible in the books of Isaiah and 2 Kings. Despite continuous warfare, Taharqa was able to build overwhelming projects throughout his empire, including a temple with carved images over 100 feet high. The Egyptian queen ascended to power at the age of 17 to become one of Africa's greatest female rulers. Intelligent and witty, her graceful nature and stunning personality were valuable diplomatic attributes. Striving to elevate Egypt to world supremacy, Cleopatra persuaded Julius Caesar and Mark Antony to renounce their Roman allegiances to fight on behalf of Egypt. Each, however, met his death before Cleopatra's dreams of conquest were realized. Disheartened, Cleopatra pressed an asp to her breast, ending the life of the world's most celebrated African queen. Osei Tutu was the founder and the first king of the Asante Nation in what is now Ghana. He was able to convince a half a dozen suspicious chiefs to join their states under his leadership. According to legend, this occurred when the golden stool descended from heaven and came to rest on Osei Tutu's knees, signifying his choice by the gods. The kingdom would endure for 2 centuries. Menelik was the overshadowing figure of his time in Africa. He converted a group of independent kingdoms into the strong, stable empire known as the United States of Abyssinia, or Ethiopia. Resisting European colonization and uniting the opposing kingdoms made him one of the great statesmen of African history. Though dead for nearly 100 years, Nihanda remains what she was when alive, the single most important person in the modern history of Zimbabwe. When English settlers invaded in 1896, Nihanda and other leaders declared war. At first, they achieved great success. But as supplies ran short, so did battlefield victories. Nihanda was eventually captured and executed. Although gone, she was not forgotten, and is still referred to as Mbayu, grandmother, Nihanda, by Zimbabwean patriots. Khama distinguished his reign by extracting technological innovations from the Europeans while resisting their attempts to colonize Bechuanaland. Advancements included the building of schools, scientific cattle breeding, and a police corps which practically eliminated crime. In 1875, Khama appealed to Queen Victoria of England to protest English settlement in his country. The English honored Khama and his call for continued freedom for Bechuanaland. For half a century, the Basotho people were ruled by the wise and just founder of their nation, King Mosweswe. The Basotho had to fight for their survival against plundering Africans, European colonialists, and particularly the Boers. As the relentless Boers were about to annihilate the Basothos, Mosweswe persuaded the British to make Masutu-land a protectorate, a diplomatic coup that helped to assure his nation's survival and to assure Mosweswe a place in African history. Nzinga of Angola was an astute diplomat and an excellent military leader. To arrest the swelling influx of slave-hunting Portuguese, she waged war for nearly 30 years. Because of her quest for freedom and relentless drive to bring peace for her people, Nzinga remains a glimmering symbol of inspiration. Samori launched a conquest to unify West Africa into a single state spanning 100,000 square miles. In each city, Samori built a mosque, a testimonial of his devotion to Islam. During the 18-year conflict with France, powerful Samori continually frustrated the Europeans. His astute military prowess prompted some of France's greatest commanders to entitle the African monarch the Black Napoleon of the Sudan. The people of Dahomey often referred to their monarch, Behanzin, as the King Shark for his strength and wisdom. Behanzin maintained a strong army to defend his nation's sovereignty, including a division of 5,000 female warriors who were noted for their formidable zeal in battle. A fond lover of the humanities, Behanzin is credited with some of the finest song and poetry ever produced in Dahomey.
In 1375, Spanish mapmakers are charting the known world. On a map of North Africa, they draw a picture of a man who has status. More gold than anyone else, and he makes all the rules. The text says, "So abundant is the gold which is found in his country, that he is the richest and most noble king in the land." His name is Mansa Musa. In 1312, when he takes power, he inherits a string of titles. King of Kings, Lion of Mali, and perhaps, most important of all, Lord of the Mines.
A survey put Mansa Musa as the world's richest man of all time. They estimated his fortune at some $400 billion. For comparison, Bill Gates came 12th on the list, with something close to a quarter of Mansa Musa's wealth. Mansa Musa is one of the most incredible characters in history, and few of us have ever heard of him.
Musa rules an immense African empire.
The Empire of Mali had the largest resources of gold known in the world at that time.
Starting at number 1, the first thing we need to make clear about Africa is something I've been stressing for quite some time. Africa is not a country. I know it's very cliche, but we really need to stress that. Because if our children understand that, they can then learn to make distinctions between the various African groups throughout history. African diversity, although beautiful, had profound impact on African history. We have to speak more about the discovery and development of iron in Africa. Historically, iron mining can be seen throughout the globe as one of the important phases of human civilization. Africa has a long history with iron. In fact, most of the continent completely skipped the Bronze Age and went straight into iron. Interestingly enough, the oldest iron mining site on the planet is in southern Africa, in the modern country of Eswatini, formerly known as Swaziland. Africa is also contemporary with other places around the world as it concerns iron smelting. Far too often, scholars have tried to explain away the development of iron in Africa south of the Sahara by claiming outside influence, but the long-running debate favors independent invention. Our school systems have to mention the great art amongst the Yoruba peoples at Ele-Ife. Ele-Ife is world-renowned for its bronze, stone, and terracotta artworks. This art was at its height around the 13th century. Ife artists developed an early expertise in bronze and terracotta works, as well as in wood and stone carvings and glass beadwork. The art of the Yoruba people single-handedly forced the world to acknowledge African ingenuity and intelligence, as some tried to assign the development of such works to ancient European travelers. The genius and graceful beauty of Yoruba sculptures can do a similar work for the impressionable minds of our youth. The idea of discovery or adventure is usually reserved for Europe, but it won't hurt to diversify that model. Mansa Musa tells us that the previous ruler before him sailed the Atlantic Ocean to explore the limits of the ocean. This history was recorded in Egypt while Mansa Musa was on his Hajj to Mecca, but what's of interest to us in the Western world is that this journey reportedly happened a whole century before the journey of Columbus himself. Our school systems should touch on classical oral literature of Africa. Africa has so much to offer when it comes to oral literature, and the stories of Gassir's lute and the epic of Sunjata Keita is a great place to start. Gassir was a Soninka prince who was running from his destiny, seeking glory on the battlefield. But running from his true purpose brought much turmoil to himself, his people, and his family. Once he accepted his purpose of becoming a griot, or oral historian, he attained the very thing he wanted all along, for his name to never die. And it seemed to work because we're talking about him today. Sunjata's story is just as epic as he became the founder of the greatest empire in West African history, the Mali Empire. We have to mention some important cities in African history. At the very least, we have to stress the importance of Timbuktu in West Africa. Timbuktu has unfortunately been relegated to mythical status in popular culture. Ironically, Mansa Musa played a part in that, because of all the attention he brought to it via association. Timbuktu began to be romanticized greatly, but the love of learning and the value of scholarship was honored in Timbuktu. In a sense, the great African city was the intellectual hub of Muslim Africa, where scholars from all over the world would come and be commissioned to teach. At that time, Timbuktu had no equal throughout the territories of the lands of the blacks, from the land of Mali to the farthest limits of the land of the West, with respect to virtue, freedom, purity, security and protection throughout the land, mercy and compassion for the poor and strangers, and friendliness and assistance to the students of knowledge. According to Leo Africanus, the principal export out of Timbuktu was actually books. Numerous judges, scholars, and priests, all well paid by the king, many manuscript books coming from Barbary are sold. Such sales are more profitable than any other goods.
African history dates back to the origins of humanity. We should be taught that our ancestors were royalty, doctors, engineers, teachers, and that many were captured and forced to live in slavery. Being forced into slavery or born in a condition of slavery does not make anyone a slave. It makes them an enslaved people. There is a false narrative that African people were enslaved because they were weak, but hopefully this information has shown you just how powerful Africans are and why they were targeted. Enslaved Africans weren't just agricultural laborers. They were bakers, barbers, blacksmiths, brewers, bricklayers, butchers, carpenters, cooks, doctors, farmers, firemen, fishermen, foremen, forgemen, founders, furnacemen, gardeners, gunsmiths, miners, musicians, nurses, preachers, sailors, shoemakers, stonemasons, tailors, tanners, and more. As we dive into our next portion of history, we want you to remember who we are, not just what happened to us.
Enslaved Africans have been shipped to the Americas since the Spanish arrived in the early 1500s. Europeans purchased slaves along the coast of West and Central Africa. The chained captives were forced onto ships destined to the New World for the long and brutal voyage known as the Middle Passage. Conditions on the ships were indescribably inhumane. The enslaved Africans weren't treated as human beings. They were treated like cargo.
Men and women shackled together, stacked on top of each other. There was a process known as tight packing, where you literally had slave trading scientists who tried to figure out the maximum way to squeeze as many human beings as possible into the holds of these ships.
Incredibly, about 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World between 1525 and 1866. About 15% didn't survive the journey.
4 centuries of trafficking in human beings. And over the course of that time, we're talking about millions of souls involved and millions of souls lost. And yet people endured. And yet they survived.
The overwhelming majority went to destinations other than North America. Of the 12.5 million Africans shipped to the New World as slaves, it's estimated about 450,000 landed on our shores. While a law passed by Congress in 1808 banned the transatlantic slave trade, thousands of slaves are estimated to have been smuggled into our country up to the Civil War. By 1860, the enslaved population in the United States had grown to about 4 million people, a staggering number when you consider that the national population at the time was 31 million. The horrors of slavery in the United States would persist until 1865, when, following the end of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment was ratified. But the repercussions of institutional slavery are still being felt to this day, as African Americans continue to fight for equal rights and for the right to be heard. What made cotton so desirable? A perfect storm. In the 1790s, America's oldest crops, like tobacco, were depleting farmland and dropping in value. At the same time, the textile industry in Great Britain was exploding, creating enormous international demand for cotton clothing. Eli Whitney's gin merely provided the motor for a global economic machine, and slavery was its fuel.
Everybody was getting a piece of it. All these northern bankers and marketing people, folks who owned the ships that transported the cotton, everybody was getting a piece of the pie.
Cotton utterly transformed the United States, making fertile land from Georgia to Texas extraordinarily valuable. The fact that Native Americans lived on these lands was a temporary inconvenience, solved by a policy of Indian removal. The massive replacement of native populations with slave plantations. It's a part of our troubled history that can still be seen from the air.
If we were flying over this prior to European settlement, we would have seen large fields of corn and beans, trees and squash. When the first English began moving in here, they began chopping down the trees and expanding the fields available for cotton.
The enormous profitability of cotton undermined the principles of the American Revolution and forever altered black life. The more money the planters made from growing cotton, the more cotton the planters wanted to grow, and that took more slaves. Slaves in the Upper South became incredibly more valuable as commodities because of this demand for them in the Deep South. They were sold off in droves, and that created a second Middle Passage. And in many ways, the second Middle Passage was just as devastating as the first. To feed King Cotton, more than 1 million African Americans were carried off into the Deep South. That's 2.5 times the number that were brought to the United States from Africa. It was the largest forced migration in American history.
I was ordained for some great purpose in the hands of the Almighty.
Nat Turner was an enslaved African-American preacher who was born in 1800 and led a large-scale rebellion in 1831.
Nat Turner's ultimate goal was to end the system of slavery. So he chose violence as his only option. And that option, painful and bloody as it was, shook up the system.
Nat Turner was a mind-blowing experience to white culture and changed the game in a fundamental way.
They vowed before they started the revolt that they would kill every white person they saw. Men, women, and children.
They were done being dehumanized, they were done being treated as property, and they just rebelled.
The rebels followed kind of a zigzag path. They stopped at most of the houses along the way, killing the slaveholders and their families who they found there.
The judgment of this court is that you are to be taken hence to jail, thence to the place of execution, and be hung by the neck until you are dead, dead, dead.
Lynching in America were spectator sports. There were spectator events. People came from miles around, and bodies were dismembered. When people went to these kinds of affairs, they wanted to take a souvenir away that proved to everybody that they were there and that that person, that monster, is now no longer alive. And how do I know that? Because I've got a piece of his body right here.
As one of the most well-known conductors of the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman rescued more than 300 slaves over the span of 11 years.
Harriet Tubman was one of the most remarkable women in American history.
Born a slave in the early 1820s, Araminta Ross changed her name to Harriet Tubman after marrying a free black man named John Tubman around 1844.
As a slave, Harriet Tubman was repeatedly whipped. She also later was hit by a lead weight mistakenly, but that lead weight caused her to experience narcolepsy for the rest of her life.
Fearing that she would be sold away from her family in 1849, Tubman fled to Philadelphia using an informal but well-organized network known as the Underground Railroad.
She felt that she would be sold away because she was viewed as a sickly person. She and two of her brothers ran away, and the brothers decided they would return to the plantation. And she, instead of abandoning them, turned around, went back with them to the plantation, and then turned around and escaped a second time by herself.
Using her own money, Tubman made separate journeys to rescue her sister and brother. And in 1851, Tubman guided a group of 11 fugitives north, earning her the nickname Moses.
Harriet Tubman was called the Moses of her people, largely because she was so successful in leading slaves out of slavery, out of the South, into the North, which symbolically is known as the Promised Land. Moses, the figure from the Bible, leading his chosen people, Tubman took on that kind of mythic quality.
In 1858, Tubman assisted abolitionist John Brown in recruiting men for the raid on Harper's Ferry. During the Civil War, Tubman became a Union Army scout, a nurse, and led an armed expedition to liberate more than 700 slaves.
Harriet Tubman was an incredibly brave African-American woman. She sacrificed her own life, and she freed probably over 1,000 people. And she said she could have freed a lot more if they had known they actually were slaves.
Although Tubman was widely well-respected during her lifetime, she was impoverished and died of pneumonia in 1913. Tubman was buried with military honors and was later named an American hero by President Barack Obama.
Harriet Tubman is one of the amazing women in history. She not only brought these slaves out, but she never lost a life.
This is the story of a husband and a wife, two enslaved people who both filed for freedom in circuit court in St. Louis, Missouri in 1846 and set off an 11-year odyssey that culminated in 1857 in the most infamous decision of the U.S. Supreme Court. Dred Scott was held as a slave by a family that moved him first to Alabama and then to Missouri. And then he was sold to another man named John Emerson, who took him to Wisconsin Territory, present-day Minnesota, where he was held at Fort Snelling. There he met Harriet Robinson, who was the slave of an Indian agent. They married, they had 2 daughters, and then John Emerson owned both of them and their children, took them back to St. Louis. That's when, in 1846, Dred and Harriet Scott filed freedom suits in St. Louis Circuit Court. They knew that there was a doctrine in state courts called once free, always free. If you were an enslaved person held in free territory, like the Wisconsin Territory, then you should be freed even in a slave state like Missouri. That 11-year odyssey took them all the way up to the Supreme Court, the one that ruled against Dred Scott in 1857. The ruling had 3 main parts. First, it said that blacks did not have rights in federal courts as federal citizens. Second, it said that slave states no longer had to honor the once free, always free doctrine. And third, it said that Congress never should have prohibited slavery in the Wisconsin Territory in the first place, or in any territories. It was a dramatic blow in the sectional crisis. It created a huge firestorm of controversy, and ultimately is one of the leading causes of the coming of the Civil War. Even though the Scotts lost their case in court, they actually won their freedom. The children of Scott's original owners, some of them in St. Louis, had become anti-slavery. They had helped fund the Scotts' legal case for many years, and now in 1857 they stepped up and bought the family and then freed them. Dred Scott lived another year, but he lived as a free man. His wife and their 2 daughters lived the rest of their lives as freed people. There are still descendants of the Scott family in America today. Despite the tragedy of the case and its infamous nature, there was a human triumph within it.
On that island sits Fort Sumter. On April 12, 1861, a single mortar shell shattered the pre-dawn sky, and the United States, just 85 years old, erupted into all-out civil war. Initially, for President Abraham Lincoln, the war was about a single overriding goal: saving the Union from the forces of secession in the American South. forces that were threatening to tear the Republic apart.
There was a ditty that people used to sing around Union recruiting that I think sums up what Lincoln's original orientation was. It went something like, I stand for the Union, all its foes I abhor. I ain't for the N-word, but I am for the war.
Soon after the war began, its focus began to change when enslaved African Americans, forced to work in the Confederacy's defense, escaped behind Union lines.
Escaped slaves who run away to Union lines are called contraband. And what Union policymakers, including Lincoln, begin to recognize is this creates a welcome disruption among the Southern slaveholders. This deprives them of their property, it shuts down their plantations, and it makes their war effort more difficult.
The swelling numbers of contraband pushed President Lincoln to see that the Civil War was actually about abolishing the institution of slavery, ultimately leading him to issue the Emancipation Proclamation.
In many ways, the Emancipation Proclamation is, first and foremost, a military policy. It's not clear the Union is winning the war before the Emancipation Proclamation. So the Emancipation Proclamation also gives these escaped slaves the opportunity to serve in the Union Army. This is crucial to the Union's success in the war effort.
With the freedom of their people at stake, almost 200,000 black men enlisted in the Union Army and Navy, playing a pivotal role in bringing victory to the North.
The key element that changed the outcome of this war in terms of who won it and in terms of what it was about were the slaves themselves. Their determination that this war was going to be about the end of slavery. Masses of self-liberated slaves became the wave that the Union would ultimately ride to victory.
Robert Smalls was a hero of both the Civil War and of Reconstruction. In 1874, he was elected to the United States House of Representatives from the state of South Carolina. Just 12 years before, he staged one of the boldest and most imaginative escapes in the history of slavery. Its daring and its timing were unbelievable. Robert Smalls was a 23-year-old slave pressed into service for the Confederacy aboard a ship called the Planter. For nearly a year, Smalls quietly observed the movements of the ship and its crew. Just before dawn, on May 13, 1862, Smalls took his chance. While the ship's officers slept ashore, Smalls and his fellow enslaved crew members pulled up anchor and eased the Planter into Charleston Harbor.
The plan was that he and the other enslaved members would meet their family members and take off and sail to Union territory. He knew that there would be danger ahead because he had to pass through 4 Confederate checkpoints. He dressed up like the captain, he even walked like the captain, so that it looked like nothing was wrong.
Smalls slipped past the first 3 checkpoints undetected. The most dangerous checkpoint remained, Fort Sumter. As dawn broke, the crew urged Smalls to take a wide berth, but Smalls knew that changing course could arouse suspicion. Smalls gave the signal. A few seconds later, the signal came back, pass on by. As the ship approached Union territory, Smalls replaced the palmetto and rebel flags with a white bedsheet that his wife had brought on board, narrowly avoiding cannon fire. Smalls, his family, and the entire crew of the Planter were now free.
Sojourner Truth was born around 1797 in Ulster County, New York. Originally named Isabella Baumfree, Truth was sold at 11 years old along with a flock of sheep for $100.
Sojourner Truth wrote about her life as a child in slavery, and she talked about experiencing sexual abuse and continued beatings and whippings by her slave owner.
Truth fled her master in 1826, 1 year before the abolition of slavery in New York, and eventually became a freed slave.
After Truth became a free woman, she had the courage to go to court
to challenge the legality of her son being sold into slavery. She was successful against so many odds, which is what makes that court case so amazing.
Inspired by religion, she changed her name to Sojourner Truth in 1843. The following year, she joined forces with abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison.
Sojourner Truth became a traveling preacher, but also she was an early women's rights advocate, and so she spoke very forcefully for that as well.
In 1850, she published her memoirs, and the following year, Truth delivered her famous speech at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention.
The speech was later retitled, Ain't I a Woman? And it was so powerful in part because it talked about the equality of work that was executed by Black people in general, that people who were free and unfree worked just as hard whether they were men or women.
Following the outbreak of the Civil War, Truth recruited troops for the Union Army and met with President Lincoln in 1864, who gave her permission to become a counselor at Freedmen's Village.
Sojourner Truth made a singular contribution during the Civil War. She agitated for Black people to be able to fight for their own freedom.
Truth continued to campaign for abolition and women's rights until her death on November 26, 1883. In 2009, a statue of Sojourner Truth was unveiled at the U.S. Capitol, commemorating her legacy.
Sojourner Truth was one of the gutsiest women in American history, Black or white.
Frederick Douglass. When you hear that name, many of us think of the former slave who played such a pivotal role in the abolition of slavery. While widely known as one of the greatest public speakers of his time, not many of us know that Douglass was also the most photographed American in the entire 19th century. Born in 1818, Douglass escaped from slavery in 1838. He became a paid traveling lecturer for the abolitionist movement in 1841.
Photography came to this country in 1839, 1840. Black photographers and white photographers opened up studios. So it became the medium of choice because it was accessible for people.
For the first time ever, the poor servant girl could now have a portrait of herself that surpassed what the most powerful king or queen could have had 10 years ago.
Douglass saw photography as a way to reclaim the image of Black people, long viciously caricatured in racist stereotypes.
If a camera accurately photographed Black or white, a man or a woman, it captured the equal and essential humanity of that man or woman.
His lectures would take him to every corner of the North and even across the Atlantic to Great Britain, and he made sure that he was photographed wherever he went.
Frederick Douglass is a master at understanding the media revolution, and specifically photography.
Douglass combined his speaking voice with the impact of the wide distribution of his image, enabling him to demonstrate that enslaved Black people were human beings.
That image, that stunning, virile African-American, that Black man, that former slave, became a ubiquitous image.
In today's terms, Frederick Douglass was a gifted social media influencer. By the time he died in 1895, Frederick Douglass had been photographed more than Presidents Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant. He had also published 3 widely reviewed autobiographies, each of which is still read and taught today.
Ida B. Wells was born in 1862 in the middle of the Civil War in Holly Springs, Mississippi, which was actually contested territory and kept being claimed by the Confederates and then by the Union. She lived through really tumultuous times. She was also orphaned at an early age. Her parents were killed in the yellow fever epidemic of the 1870s that swept through the Mississippi Valley. And she was left at 16 years old to take care of her 5 surviving brothers and sisters. After her parents passed, their friends were going to take the children and split them up, and I did not want this to happen. She became a teacher essentially to support her brothers and sisters and keep the family together. She's only 16, but she had basic education, which was enough in those days to teach at a rural country school where she'd educate black children. She had a lot of responsibility at an early age, and she managed to somehow rise to it. Wells seems to have been a sort of natural feminist from the beginning. She never really seemed to see any reason why she couldn't do everything a man could do. And the fact that she had to support her brothers and sisters from an early age may have sort of shaped her idea of herself as someone who was, sort of head of a family. By the early 1880s, Ida had moved to Memphis, and she was still teaching in rural schools, so she was traveling back and forth to work on what was then a newfangled thing, which was a train. One day, she took her seat in what was then known as the ladies' car. It was the second car on the train. They typically only had two, and they were reserved for women. They were non-smoking, they were sometimes more comfortable, and Wells had ridden in them previously, but this particular day, she was told that she could not sit in it. She insisted that she could. She had bought a ticket for that car, and she ended up having an enormous fight with the conductor. He tried to pull her out physically. She bit him. They cast her out. She got a ride home in a wagon and immediately sued the railroad. Her suit wound through the courts for several years. In the lower courts, she won. The judge said that she was a respectable-looking person. She was, in fact, a lady, so there's no reason why she shouldn't ride in the ladies' car. But when it got to the state Supreme Court, she lost. Tennessee was in the process of implementing segregation during this time, which really took shape after the Civil War, so she couldn't win. She was devastated by not winning, but it turned her into an activist. That was sort of the beginning of her activism. And it was also the beginning of her being a journalist, because she wrote up her experience in a church newspaper called The Living Way. Ida B. Wells was not alone. There were a few black women journalists during her time. But she was distinctive in the fact that she wrote about a variety of subjects. She didn't just write for the women's page. She was a political independent. She weighed in on things like disenfranchisement and segregation and so forth. She rapidly became really the most prominent black female journalist. She actually wrote during her early years under the pen name Iola, which she chose as a sort of countrified name to evoke her rural upbringings and speak to the fact that she wanted to speak to the common people. She wanted to speak to everyone. She was known for being very outspoken and lively. She got this nickname, Iola, Princess of the Press. Wells became a leader in anti-lynching and essentially almost invented it, I would say, because of a sort of terrible personal experience she had. It was a terrible lynching in Memphis in which 3 black men were killed, and one of them was a man named Thomas Moss, a local businessman as well as a local mailman who was a friend of Wells along with his wife. Wells is out of town when this happens, and she comes back to find black people fleeing Memphis, her friend Thomas dead along with 2 other men. She had been thinking that, she would live in the South and she would work to make it a better place. But when she looked at someone like Thomas Moss, who had been a devout churchgoer, taught Sunday school, invested in his own business, done everything that the sort of world said that blacks needed to do to get ahead, and then had ended up being lynched, she began to question whether you could really do anything in the South. She published an editorial that went essentially too far in saying all this, and a white mob stormed the office of the Free Speech and destroyed the printing press. Wells was fortunate she wasn't there, but the mob left a note basically telling whoever was printing the newspaper that they should leave town and putting a death threat. She ended up in New York, where she was hired by T. Thomas Fortune, the publisher of the New York Age, and led what was basically sort of the first anti-lynching campaign, where she identified lynching as a crime and was trying to push the government and social reformers to take action about it. Anti-lynching would become a major commitment for the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and it would also be a major commitment of Black women's clubs, and other civil rights organizations.
In our creation of tonight's program, we were able to work with Douglas McQuarrie from the Charles H. Wright Museum. Douglas shared with us that slavery is an ugly side of humanity, but it is very much a human condition. One group of people has always found some reason to mistreat or enslave another. No matter whom the enslaved were, if you investigate it, you will find that before the time of enslavement, the people had a rich history. So we must realize that slavery is merely something that happened to those people. Slavery is not who those people are. Carl Jung said, "I am not what happened to me. I am who I choose to become." Even through adversity, Black people still rose to excellence. Let's take a look at the excellence that was birthed during post-slavery and the people who were pivotal in moving us forward.
Separate but equal. That was the rationale for decades of degrading, suffocating racial segregation from birth to death, in schools and churches, in housing and hospitals, in hotels and restaurants, even in cemeteries. And it was made constitutional by the United States Supreme Court in the notorious 1896 case, Plessy versus Ferguson. The citizen at the center of that case was named Homer Plessy, a 30-year-old shoemaker from New Orleans. In June 1892, Plessy boarded the whites-only car of a train. When the conductor asked him if he was colored, Plessy, who's said to have been 1/8 Black, replied yes.
Louisiana had passed a law, the Separate Car Act, which required that transportation companies provide separate but equal accommodations for Negroes and for whites.
When Plessy refused to move to the colored car, he was arrested as part of a planned effort orchestrated by a group of citizens to use the courts to overturn Jim Crow segregation laws.
Plessy did not win his case, and he continued to appeal it all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal was legal, that it did not violate the 14th Amendment, and that it was beyond the law to legislate social equality between the races.
Plessy versus Ferguson enshrined separate but equal, and separate but equal becomes kind of the law of the land, and our country becomes an apartheid state really until the beginnings of the Civil Rights Movement, and beginning with Brown versus Board of Education that begins to knock down that house of cards.
Separate but equal remained the law of the land for nearly 60 years, until another generation of judges on the Supreme Court struck it down unanimously in 1954 in the landmark school desegregation case, Brown versus the Board of Education.
Brown versus Board of Education was followed by massive resistance. You had 101 United States congressmen signing a manifesto that they would use all legal means necessary to resist Brown versus Board of Education. And we are continuing to live with the effect of government policies that have never been fully, powerfully, or radically undone.
In 1872, a young man set out on foot on a 500-mile journey across the state of Virginia. His name was Booker T. Washington, and he was heading for the Hampton Institute, a school that had been founded for the training of the freedmen and the freedwomen following the Civil War. Little did he know that he would become that school's most famous graduate.
He takes both agricultural courses as well as academic courses. He excels at both, but he's most taken by the philosophy that African Americans should try to build economic power through industrial education.
Booker T. Washington becomes the principal and leader of Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama, a school for African Americans, and creates it into something that no one ever saw before.
Under his direction, Tuskegee became one of the leading institutions of higher learning for African Americans in the country. His success brought him a great deal of national attention and launched him onto the lecture circuit. In 1895, he delivered his most famous and most controversial address. It became known as the Atlanta Compromise. The speech was artfully crafted to impress his largely white and extremely conservative audience. In the speech, Washington urged African Americans to focus on long-term economic development rather than continue to agitate for their civil and political rights.
He thought that it was best for African Americans to gain an industrial education and ideally translate that into land ownership, business ownership, and build up institutions of their own.
In a way, Booker T is saying we have to remember that our well-being relies on the goodwill of white people. And the best way to ensure our future is to make ourselves useful to white people rather than agitating for a partnership they clearly are not ready to give to us.
To his most searching critics, Washington was leading African Americans backwards towards slavery. But some of his behind-the-scenes efforts reveal a more complex picture.
At the same time as his public-facing politics were accommodationist, he's also funding anti-discrimination lawsuits challenging Jim Crow segregation. So he understood the problems of segregation. He was trying to find a way for the masses to survive and endure until the context changed.
When Carver arrived in the South, there were roughly 5 million black farmers there. Only about 1/5 of them owned any land. Almost all of them shared a common problem: over-reliance on cotton as the region's main cash crop, together with the sharecropper system used to produce it, which depleted the soil and kept tenant farmers in a permanent state of impoverishment. Improving the practice of Southern agriculture and the lot of poor farmers became Carver's chief concern.
I think that Carver quickly recognized whatever preconceptions he had about the South when he went down there, he quickly recognized the enormity of the challenges he faced. And so I think he concluded very quickly that he had to come up with some practical ways that would improve the lives of mostly the tenant farmers and the sharecroppers who were living in the South. And he tried to impact their lives in tangible, specific ways that would help them on a day-to-day basis.
Carver began urging farmers to rotate crops and to use organic fertilizers. He preached the value of planting soil-restoring crops such as peanuts, sweet potatoes, black-eyed peas, and soybeans.
He adapts it to the circumstance and develops a very different version of what scientific agriculture should be, one that emphasizes ecological thinking to a degree that very few, maybe no other progressive era endeavors did. In the late 1930s, he looks back over his career and says, "My work is that of conservation." And what did he mean by that? What would change about the way we understand America's conservation tradition if we took him seriously, if we looked at his work as a part of that broader American tradition of conservation?
He issued bulletins that uneducated farmers could understand, explaining how these soil-restoring crops should be grown and what they could be used for. He devised a traveling demonstration wagon called the Jessup Wagon and traveled dusty roads to teach small groups of farmers how to improve their lives. Start where you are with what you have, he would say. Make something of it. Never be satisfied.
At the 1900 Paris Exposition, one exhibit stood out among the rest. The exhibit of American Negroes displayed more than 350 photographs of African Americans to challenge racist stereotypes and display black social and economic achievement in a way the world had never seen before. The exhibit was compiled by one W.E.B. Du Bois. A pioneer in the fields of history and sociology, Dr. Du Bois was a well-known author and activist. He'd been illuminating the Black experience through his research and writing when he was asked to help curate an exhibit on African Americans at the Paris Exposition, an international World's Fair organized to celebrate the start of the new century.
Du Bois automatically recognizes that photography needs to be playing a prominent role in recasting how African Americans are perceived on this global stage.
He put together a remarkable exhibit using photographic representation to demonstrate the progress of the race, but also the beauty of the race.
Du Bois was highly educated, deeply cosmopolitan, and thoroughly middle class. He highlighted these same qualities, the qualities of the so-called New Negro, in the portraits he curated. In addition to more than 300 photographs, Du Bois also displayed dozens of charts and drawings, illustrating the social and economic status of African Americans. Du Bois demonstrated that African Americans were dignified, respectable human beings.
The exhibition confronted stereotypes, offering alternatives to things like minstrelsy, and offered a different perspective of what Black life was like.
More than 45 million people visited the show. The remarkable portraits and data visualizations would help globalize the New Negro movement, part of an attempt by African Americans to counter the negative racial imagery of Black people called upon to justify Jim Crow segregation. Energized by his triumph in Paris, Du Bois would go on to write his most famous book, The Souls of Black Folk, lay the foundation for the Niagara movement in 1905, and helped create the NAACP in 1909, making him one of the greatest intellectuals in American history and a hero for all time.
Robert Smalls, Dred Scott, Nat Turner, Harriet Tubman, Ida B. Wells. The list of Black heroes is miles long. These people were willing to give voice to Black pain, injustice, and put legs to their prayers, and because of that, this next portion of Black history was birthed.
Most early films consisted of one reel, lasted around 15 minutes, and cost a few $100s to produce. All of that changed in 1915, when a film called The Birth of a Nation, a 3-hour-long saga, was released by director D.W. Griffith. It instantly stood out as a technological and storytelling marvel. It also stood out as a monumental piece of blatantly racist propaganda.
The Birth of a Nation fixes a certain story of the Civil War and Reconstruction in the minds of the American public. And that story is that Black people were too lazy and ignorant to fully master the citizenship that they were offered by Reconstruction.
Birth of a Nation really didn't have Black people in it. So these are white people in blackface portraying congressmen who are obviously not ready for self-government, portraying the idea of the rapist. And these are all the stereotypes that are believed by many, many Americans.
The film was met with fierce resistance from African Americans, particularly from a recently founded organization focused on the advancement of the race, the NAACP.
One of the most important early initiatives of the NAACP was organizing against the Birth of a Nation. They generated a lot of interest by protesting the film and drew in a great deal of support from African Americans.
Despite its best efforts, the NAACP couldn't persuade censorship boards or theaters to limit the film's reach. But the young organization gained national prominence because of this campaign. That year, membership almost doubled, and that number would continue to grow as it mounted the fight against Jim Crow.
Those activists dissented at the time, and those dissenting voices were always there. They were there during the darkest periods of American history. And remembering that tradition to me is almost more important than remembering the failures and the losses and the terrorism that black people faced.
Reeling from the unprecedented devastation of a global pandemic, nurturing wounds from a brutal military victory abroad, struggling to accommodate demobilized soldiers into a slumping economy fraught with heated competition for jobs, Jim Crow's separate but equal policies endorsed by the President of the United States himself, now firmly in place as the law of the land, white supremacists targeted terrorist attacks on an all-too-familiar scapegoat. In another epidemic, black citizens found themselves on the lethal end of an outbreak of racial violence in 1919, so horrific that the civil rights leader James Weldon Johnson called it the Red Summer. The events unfolding across the United States today, in the wake of the brutal murder of George Floyd, are an eerie repetition of events that marred the history of race relations in this country almost exactly a century ago. African American soldiers returned from noble service in Europe during World War I, fully expecting that their sacrifices to their country would at long last entitle them to their full rights as equal citizens. Instead, the uniforms they wore literally became targets on their backs.
W.E.B. Du Bois famously said that we return from fighting, we return fighting. We've saved democracy overseas and we're going to save it in the United States. That didn't happen.
Between April and November of 1919, with the country devastated by an influenza pandemic known as the Spanish flu, racial unrest rolled through the South, the North, and the Midwest, where the Great Migration was just unfolding in its earliest years.
The migration, of course, had transformed large parts of the North and the West. In 1915, there were hardly a few black people in Chicago. By 1919, 1.2 million people have spread themselves across the map.
This demographic transformation of the color of the urban North, coupled with the stresses of a post-war economic downturn, combined to create the volatile conditions under which African American workers conveniently became magnets for white resentment and fear.
The pushback was fierce. Chicago was racked by fights along a dividing artery between one population and the other. Hundreds of people are dead. Cities are smoldering.
It was one of the most vicious, virulent, and violent race riots in our nation's history.
Small towns were also shaken by race-fueled violence. In Elaine, Arkansas, for example, white vigilantes joined plantation owners, sheriffs, deputies, and even state officials to battle what they called an uprising. Hundreds of black sharecroppers were murdered merely for trying to form a union. Yet in the aftermath, a grand jury callously indicted more than 100 black women and men for their so-called crimes. Of course, racial violence was anything but new in the America of that time. Still, amid the fallout from the Great War, the rising generation, calling themselves New Negroes, was not about to fold their tents. Instead, Red Summer saw black Americans not only picking up arms to defend themselves, but also utilizing political organizations like the NAACP to challenge the violence in Congress, in the courts, in the media, and on the streets. In If We Must Die, the poet Claude McKay captured the tenor of the times in his immortal call for defiance in the face of tyranny and terror. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back.
something terrible happened here. And for decades, people didn't talk about it.
I was an adult before I ever heard about it. It was something that was hidden.
This entire historic community was obliterated.
Bodies dumped in rivers, bodies dumped in mass graves. It was an absolute massacre.
This story isn't one you'll find in most history books. And almost 100 years later, the facts of what exactly happened that day are still unraveling. In 1921, a neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma called the Greenwood District was a bustling community of Black-owned businesses. Tulsa locals know that period of Greenwood's history as a kind of golden age.
If you can imagine just like an old-time downtown, things like movie theaters, pharmacies, hair salons, and so forth.
They called it Black Wall Street.
It was a mecca. It was a huge success.
But Black Wall Street was also an anomaly. It thrived at a time when the KKK was incredibly active in Oklahoma, and the nation had just been through the Red Summer of 1919, when white mobs murdered Black people in dozens of incidents across the U.S.
There needed to be a sort of match or an igniter tossed on these embers. And that trigger event was an incident that involved two teenagers, Dick Rowland, 19-year-old Black boy who shined shoes downtown, Sarah Page, 17-year-old white girl who ran an elevator in a downtown building called the Drexel Building. He went to the building, boarded the elevator. Something happened. Sarah Page began to scream. They both ran out of the elevator.
Now, we don't know exactly what happened in this elevator, but a day later, Rowland was arrested and taken to the courthouse. The local newspaper ran an article claiming Rowland had assaulted Page. Even though Page refused to press charges, the article was essentially a call to action for whites.
A large white mob began to gather on the lawn of the courthouse. Dick Rowland was in jail on the top floor. A number of Black men, several dozen, marched down to the courthouse to protect him, some of them armed. There was a struggle between one of the Black men in the small group and one of the white men in the larger group, and things sort of went south from that point.
Hundreds of white people descended upon Black Wall Street, armed. Black residents withdrew behind the railroad tracks that marked off the Greenwood District. Some of them were armed and fought back, but they were outnumbered by the white mob, which shot their way through. The white mob murdered, they looted, and they set fire to Black Wall Street.
This was the strategy, if you will, of how to deal with these communities, with these successful Black communities. The effects were disastrous.
For 2 days, the Greenwood District burned. Martial law was declared, and the National Guard was brought in. By the time the massacre ended, Greenwood was in ruins. More than 1,200 homes were destroyed, and 35 blocks burned. The exact number of casualties is harder to pin down. Some initially only reported that white people died. Others reported somewhere between 30 and 100 mostly Black casualties. But estimates now put that number closer to 300. As for those that survived, thousands of them lived in tent cities in the months that followed, and were left to pick up the pieces of rubble they once called home. After the massacre, the cover-up started. Records went missing from city files, including the very article that started it all. It makes photos from this time all the more important as part of the historical record, but back in 1921, these images served a very different purpose.
So photo postcards like these were pretty widely distributed after the massacre. At the time, they were a part of white supremacist culture and kept as souvenirs of racially charged crimes.
Now they're preserved to make sure this part of Tulsa's history isn't forgotten, and they paint a clear picture of how much destruction there was that day. On the postcards, it's called the Tulsa Race Riot, a name that itself sort of erases what really happened.
By calling it a riot, it's a way of trying to rewrite the history, assuming that there were both sides at fault. And that was not the case. I call it a massacre, and I call it that because that's what it was.
Greenwood eventually rebuilt, but nearly a century later, there's a part of this story that still haunts the city. No one actually knows where the victims' bodies are. Some mention trucks, like this one, loaded with victims of the riot. One riot witness in particular came forth testifying that he saw bodies being dumped in Oaklawn Cemetery.
This is it. This is the area.
Using the survivor accounts, records, and eventually radar, the city was able to pinpoint 3 locations with anomalies in the soil. Only one step was left: to excavate. But it was something the city at the time wasn't up for doing. For many Tulsans, it was a part of history best forgotten and not worth investigating. In some ways, today, that sentiment remains.
Kind of waste of money.
Why do you think that?
It's over, it's done with.
But there are clear signs of a city that's ready to come to terms with a dark chapter in its history.
Honestly, that's a lot of missing people that probably had families.
We owe it to the people whose blood has actually fertilized the grounds of this place.
There was a tremendous amount of racism.
Injustice plus time does not equal justice.
Today, a new mayor is reopening the investigation.
I think a pretty basic compact that a city makes with its citizens is, if somebody murders you, we will do everything we can to find out what happened to you and give your family closure. And whether you were murdered yesterday or you were murdered 98 years ago.
The city will be looking into the 3 areas that the commission noted. That process of finding out what lies beneath Tulsa and DNA matching any remains with descendants could take years. The investigation is just one part of a bigger historical reckoning, but the reality is it can't undo the crimes or the cover-up of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre.
The Harlem Renaissance is one of the most iconic cultural periods in African American history. Throughout the decade of the 1920s, Black writing, art, and music flourished, ushering in a cultural revolution that rocked the United States.
One of the most important factors that accounted for the rise of what we know of as the Harlem Renaissance is the migration of Black peoples from the South to urban centers like Harlem.
The Jim Crow era began after Reconstruction, and every Southern African American had to think about, what should we do? Should we go or should we stay? For many of these people, it was a matter of life and death, literally.
Sometimes in the most repressive times, we create the most extraordinary art.
Amidst the fervor of the Great Migration, bold, exciting forms of Black music evolved, along with venues to listen and dance to this music. Blues and jazz clubs became a central part of life in Harlem, where artists such as Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, Bessie and Mamie Smith rose to prominence.
Then began to cry. He went away and never even said goodbye.
The era also saw the burgeoning of literary work by and about African Americans, which the writer Alain Locke compiled into an anthology. He called it The New Negro, and its name came to define a movement.
The Harlem Renaissance is a facet of a larger movement that we think of as the New Negro movement, where you have a new generation of Black people, by this point 2 generations out of slavery, using the arts as a way to help people gain broader civil and political rights.
Some of the framers of what became the Renaissance make the argument that the artistic worth of a people has to be proven by the worth of the art and literature they produced, and especially for people that historically, over centuries, have been defined as without culture, without history, and without any record of achievement.
The Harlem Renaissance was the flowering of creativity that had been suppressed for centuries. People that had this sense that things were opening up. And finally, we can be the people that we imagine ourselves to be.
On April 15th, 1947, when Jackie Robinson walked onto the field for the Brooklyn Dodgers, he broke Major League Baseball's color line, forever changing the sport and race relations in America. Jackie Robinson was an extraordinary athlete, lettering in 4 varsity sports at UCLA. During World War II, he was drafted into the Army. He was court-martialed after refusing to move to the back of a segregated military bus. Robinson fought his case. He was acquitted, then honorably discharged.
So he always had a sense of fairness, always had a sense of racial justice and social justice.
In 1945, because the major leagues remained segregated, Robinson joined the Negro Leagues and played for the Kansas City Monarchs. Meanwhile, sports writers from African American newspapers were pressuring the major leagues to integrate. Branch Rickey, general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, decided he'd act and began a search for the perfect prospect. Robinson's college education and his ability to endure the racist attacks that inevitably would ensue convinced Rickey that it was Robinson who was the ideal candidate to become the first African-American major league player. Rickey signed Robinson to the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. Despite racist abuse from opposing teams and taunting by the crowds, Robinson managed to focus on the game. But the cost was high. He suffered indignities because of a commitment not to fight back. Gradually, he built a fan base, excelled on the field, and then was named Rookie of the Year. Even naysayers couldn't deny his outstanding talent as he led the Brooklyn Dodgers to their first and only World Series championship. When he retired, Robinson turned his attention to the civil rights movement.
He's a frontline participant, lending his prestige and his presence to these causes for civil rights.
He supported protests in Alabama, attended the March on Washington, and was one of the NAACP's biggest fundraisers. Yet Robinson saw civil rights as more than a political movement.
He engages in business and entrepreneurial activities. It speaks to his multifaceted approach, do away with Jim Crow, but create opportunities for African Americans.
By breaking the color line in America's favorite pastime, Jackie Robinson opened the door for integration far beyond the baseball field.
On May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its landmark decision in the case of Brown versus Board of Education. The court ruled unanimously that racial segregation in public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. This decision grew out of several cases that challenged racial segregation in schools across America. Because the lawsuits addressed the same legal questions, the Supreme Court consolidated them into one case. Its lead plaintiff was Oliver Brown. He sued the Topeka, Kansas Board of Education on behalf of his daughter, Linda. She was a black public school student who lived just a few blocks from an elementary school in Topeka. However, she was forced to travel over an hour to reach the all-black school she was assigned to attend. When she tried to enroll in the closer neighborhood school, which was all white, the request was denied. In the U.S. Supreme Court, Brown was represented by NAACP lawyer Thurgood Marshall. He argued that segregated schools were harmful and left black children with feelings of inferiority. The court unanimously decided in Brown's favor, declaring that separate educational facilities were, without exception, unequal. Chief Justice Earl Warren declared that, quote, "In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place." And while it didn't happen immediately, this ruling paved the way for integration and was a major victory for the civil rights movement. brutal murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till remains one of the darkest moments in the civil rights era. On August 20th, 1955, the Chicago teen went to visit relatives in Money, Mississippi. While there, Till and a group of friends went into a store to buy candy. Unaware of the racial tone in the Mississippi Delta, Till spoke to a white female storekeeper in a manner she deemed offensive. On August 28, 1955, the storekeeper's husband, Roy Bryant, and his half-brother, J.W. Milam, abducted Till at gunpoint from his great-uncle's home. They drove him to a shed, where they took turns torturing and beating him with a pistol. The pair then drove the battered teen to the edge of the Tallahatchie River. There they ordered him to remove his clothes and shot him in the head. Then they attached a heavy fan to his neck and rolled his body into the river. On August 31st, 1955, the body of Emmett Till was discovered by two young boys. Heartbroken and grief-stricken by the brutality of her son's death, Mamie Till Bradley defiantly held an open-casket funeral in Chicago for her son. She even sent pictures of his disfigured body to newspapers and magazines, saying the whole nation had to bear witness to this. Blacks, including young kids like myself, saw this horrendous picture in Jet magazine and other black publications. In September 1955, Bryant and Milam were indicted for Emmett Till's murder. During the three-day trial, prosecutors presented testimony from Till's great-uncle and Willie Reed, an African-American sharecropper who overheard Bryant and Milam torturing Till. On September 23, 1955, after deliberating for just over 1 hour, the all-white male jury found the defendants not guilty. 7 years after their acquittal, one juror admitted during an interview that most of the jurors believed Bryant and Milam were guilty, but acquitted them because the mandatory punishment of life in prison or death seemed too harsh to impose on white men for killing a black boy.
Nearly a century after the end of the Civil War and the dawn of Reconstruction, African Americans still found themselves fighting for their basic rights as citizens. The modern civil rights movement in the mid-20th century finally secured them.
Most historians actually date the start of the formal civil rights movement to Brown versus Board of Education. Brown really stokes the fervor of the nation. Then, in December of 1955, Rosa Parks decided as an act of resistance that she would not give up her seat to a white man on the bus.
Rosa Parks' deliberate act of resistance led to a bus boycott that thrust into the limelight a young preacher with a PhD. He would become one of the movement's most charismatic leaders. His name was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
One of the most iconic moments is the March on Washington in 1963, led by Martin Luther King Jr.
200,000 people converge on the nation's capital to rally for civil rights. They come united in one cause.
One day right now in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
This becomes visualized on the news and begins to change the way that Americans are starting to think about the civil rights movement.
As the civil rights movement attained greater visibility, it was often met with increased brutality and violence. Yet in the midst of so much sacrifice and heartbreak, the work of civil rights activists began to bear fruit.
In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of '64, and that's designed to desegregate businesses and government employment. And then in 1965, President Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act of '65.
The passage of the Voting Rights Act was a monumental victory for African Americans. Tragically, just 3 years after it was passed, Dr. King would be assassinated. Many feel, looking back, that the movement died that day. But in fact, the movement took on new forms and continued. And it must continue today, as important victories such as the Voting Rights Act are under attack.
Until we deal with the fact that the backlash is often made possible not just by the other side growing in power, but by those who claim to care about equality losing their own resolve, there will be moments of this cycle happening over and over again.
In 1965, President Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, bringing down one of the last legal vestiges of Jim Crow segregation. Just 5 days later, an altercation between an unarmed black man and the police sparked riots on the streets of Watts, a predominantly black neighborhood in Los Angeles. The riots revealed that America still faced deep racial issues, and in the coming years, urban unrest roiled cities across the nation.
Dr. King's message of nonviolence wore thin as the 1960s progressed, particularly because violence is everywhere.
As race relations deteriorated, Stokely Carmichael, a young, charismatic, electrifying speaker, was searching for a new way to reframe the civil rights struggle. And he found it through one resonant metaphor.
It's time we stand up and take over. Don't be afraid. Don't be ashamed. We want black power. We want black power. We want black power.
The civil rights movement had been extraordinarily successful, but there has not necessarily been the tangible transformation in black people's living conditions. Carmichael is making an argument that only black power will take black people to that next level.
Hey, what do you want? That's what we gonna get.
The effect is electrifying. Soon after, black power groups were organizing across the country, each with their own idea about what the phrase actually meant.
You got everybody from those that are saying, yes, let's go for elected office, to those that say, let's overthrow the government.
It called for self-determination. It called for an end to nonviolence as the only strategy of the black movement.
Looking back, black power marked a startling shift in the civil rights movement and in the evolution of black consciousness.
Black power is really going to inspire a whole new wave of black elected officials and inspire the black arts movement, using culture to transform what we think of as black identity, proud, strong black women and men.
Black, the word that for decades so many African Americans most dreaded being called, almost overnight became both a battle cry and a badge of honor.
I'm so thankful for every person who went before us and made a way. Black people continue to exhibit their strength and independence, individuality, and value to the world. We want to highlight a few people who have added so much to our world.
Michael Jordan reinvented basketball. His unparalleled grace, athleticism, and determination cementing him as the greatest. A Hall of Famer with a lasting legacy he's only added to off the court.
Throughout Mae Jemison's life, excelling in one area has never been enough. Sure, we know her as the first African-American woman in space, but there's so much more that makes Jemison extraordinary. Mae grew up in Chicago, where like most kids, she dreamed of being a fashion designer, archaeologist, or astronaut. She decided at an early age she would go to space. Astronauts back then were exclusively white and male, but those aboard the USS Enterprise on Star Trek were different, particularly Lieutenant Uhura. and that allowed young Mae to see someone that looked like her in space. Even as a kid, she was extraordinary. She graduated high school at 16 and went to Stanford. She double majored in chemical engineering and African and Afro-American studies. During her junior year, she had to decide if she should be a doctor or a professional dancer, which were both legitimate options for her. She chose medical school and even worked in a Cambodian refugee camp in Thailand. And she didn't just become a doctor. In 1983, she became the area Peace Corps medical officer for Sierra Leone and Liberia in West Africa. She managed all the healthcare for the Peace Corps, wrote manuals for self-care, researched rabies with the CDC, and was in charge of medical care for the U.S. Embassy. And she was 27. After 2 years there, she returned to America and began working as a general practitioner in Los Angeles and took graduate-level engineering classes at the same time. And even then, she was still like, I could do more. So she applied to become an astronaut in 1985 and wasn't deterred when the Challenger exploded the next year. She reapplied and was selected out of 2,000 applicants to train to be an astronaut.
And liftoff of Space Shuttle Endeavour.
September 12, 1992, Jemison made history when she took off aboard the Endeavour for 8 days in space. As a science mission specialist, her job was to conduct experiments on the crew on motion sickness and bone cells. After her big dream was realized, Jemison decided to take it easy as an environmental studies professor at Dartmouth College, starting an educational nonprofit, a science camp, and serving as principal for 100-Year Starship, an initiative working to travel beyond our solar system in the next 100 years. Oh, and in 1993, she guest starred on Star Trek: The Next Generation. Jemison has gone back and forth on this whole role model thing. She didn't really want to be the poster child for black female astronauts, but she did want young girls, and the old white men that would hire them someday, to see that your race or gender doesn't limit you.
Sophia Dannenberg is the first African-American woman, first African-American, period, to summit Mount Everest. It's an accomplishment she never planned on achieving.
At the time, I probably thought I was going to grow up to be like a doctor or a lawyer or something, but I was always one of those kids who was exploring and figuring out different things.
We gather to celebrate Black History Month, and from our earliest days, Black history has been American history. We're the slaves who carried the stone to build this White House, the soldiers who fought for our nation's independence, who fought to hold this union together, who fought for freedom. America's a nation that is a constant work in progress. That's why we are exceptional. We don't stop. There's a gap, there always will be, between who we are and the perfect union, that ideal that we see. But what makes us exceptional, what makes us Americans, is that we fight wars and pass laws and we march and we organize unions and we stage protests, and that gap gets smaller over time. And it's that effort to form a more perfect union. Marks us as a people.
Black excellence, black excellence, black excellence, black excellence. Look at me black and I'm excellent. 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 Black excellence, black excellence, black excellence, black excellence. Look at me black and I'm excellent. 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 Look at me black and I'm excellent.
Tonight has been a night full of education, community, and reverence. Although we couldn't highlight every person in Black history who exhibited excellence, drop in the comments one fact that stood out to you or one person that inspired you tonight. We would like to thank Apostle Clarence Langston and Pastor Robin Langston for this night of Black excellence. We hope you were inspired tonight to do your own digging and discover the layers of excellence that lay in our rich history. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Until next time, be blessed and be excellent.
black, excellence, black, excellence, black, excellence, black, excellence. Look at me, black, and I'm excellent.